Welcome to Chapter 27, where we'll talk about post-war America. I think this is an interesting time period in history because now we're getting to a point where perhaps you know someone connected to this era, maybe a grandparent or a parent who might have served in the war or who was born as part of the baby boom. So this is an interesting part because it's where we start really having some connections with the period. So let's talk a little about Harry S. Truman. Truman took office after FDR's death. He was a Democrat, but he was a little more liberal than FDR. So we're going to start seeing during Truman's administration a real attempt at ending segregation, the first real attempt since Reconstruction, actually. So we'll talk a little more about that. Truman came to national prominence for uncovering waste and corruption in the Defense Department. And that's what led FDR to choose him as his vice presidential running mate. But when FDR died, Truman was really unprepared to be president. He had not been privy to any of the consultations about the war. He wasn't involved in any of the War Council discussions, and he knew he was at a disadvantage. He also knew it was very important that the country not be at that disadvantage. So he threw himself into the job 100%, so that he could do his very best in leading the nation to get beyond that. In the election of 1948, where Truman actually runs for the office, he's got some challenges, or he's got some things leading up to his run. First thing is the Taft-Hartley Act, which was passed by Congress. Congress at the time, remember, is made up of Republicans and Dixiecrats. Talk about those in just a minute. But the Taft-Hartley Act made it illegal to strike and boycott. So basically, they stripped labor unions of any negotiating power that they ever had. And it also allowed individual states to create these right-to-work laws that forbid union membership requirement. So sometimes if someone got a job in a factory, they were required to join the union. So the Taft-Hartley Act ended that requirement. So we have unions that maybe aren't as strong, and they don't have a lot of power at that point. Congress also refused to end segregated armed forces and Truman's Fair Employment Act. So I mentioned that during Truman's time, he's really trying to initiate some civil rights laws, and one of those was the end to segregated armed forces, because World War II showed that people fought no matter their race, and he wanted to end that, but Congress refused. And the Fair Employment Act would have also continued equal employment opportunities for all races, and Congress neglected that as well. So despite his relationship with Congress, and maybe because of it, maybe the American public said, oh, he does want to make some changes, but Congress is holding him up. So Truman won re-election. He beat Republican Thomas Dewey and Dixiecrat Strom Thurmond. The Dixiecrats were these people who were Southern Democrats, but they were focused on segregation. They very much supported segregation, keeping things separate between races. And they really opposed Truman's attempts at civil rights. So Truman's policy, he liked to call it the Fair Deal, based on FDR's New Deal that was so popular. So Truman's Fair Deal would extend unemployment benefits, wanted to provide equal jobs for minorities, and increase the minimum wage, get this, from 40, oh, there's a typo, that shouldn't be fro, it should be from 40 to 65 cents per hour. Can you imagine 65 cents per hour? And that would have been a great wage at the time. It's important to remember, our minimum wage, we've had increases throughout the years to the federal minimum wage, and it's, it hasn't always been, $9, $10 an hour. I know one day I was helping clean up some things from my mom's paperwork after she passed away, and I found a W-2 from my dad's job when he was an elected county official in Hot Spring County back in the 70s. And For that year, I think it was 1974, his total income was $6,900. I could not imagine. We were a family of four. We had a new house. We had a new car. And we did all of that on $6,900. I mean, it's just amazing to me. And so 65 cents an hour at the end of the 40s, I mean, wow, just wow. Anyway, so also the fair deal. One of the bad things that Truman did was he got rid of FDR's administration, who were experienced in working with the New Deal administration, replaced them with his old cronies from Missouri. So probably not the best idea. It wasn't illegal at all, but probably not the best situation to start off in, especially if you're not very experienced in what you're doing. Anyway, like I've mentioned already, Congress was made up of Republicans and Dixiecrats, which made it really tough for Truman to get this agenda passed, especially since it focused on fair treatment, fair jobs for minorities. So naturally, Congress rejected parts of these fair deal initiatives established by Truman. One rejected was a farm program that included some income subsidies for farmers. It also rejected his attempt to add federal health insurance to Social Security and the attempt to give federal financial aid for education. He did get the increase in minimum wage, and they did extend Social Security to 9 million more people. And they did support the Housing Act of 1949, which created some low-cost federal housing options. So the Republican decade begins with the election of Eisenhower and Nixon as vice president. Now, scandal followed Nixon. You may associate Nixon with Watergate, which happened as he was president, but he had a scandal when he was vice president as well. Apparently, he'd received a donation to his political fund from a rather unscrupulous businessman. Nixon addressed it head on and said, first of all, he did not gain personally from it, and he was not a rich man. So, yes, he accepted the donation for his campaign. I mean, how else are you going to run for office if you don't have money? That whole idea of not being a rich man really resonated with the majority of the American public. The only other gift he said that he received during his time in office was a black and white Cocker Spaniel that his daughters actually named Checkers, and they loved that dog. And he said, he was not taking that dog away from his daughters and giving it back. That also resonated with the general public. And so through that first scandal, people really kind of started to love Nixon. And if people loved Nixon, they liked Ike. That was his campaign slogan in 1952. Actually, I've just noticed this slide is wrong. It says won again in 1952. They actually won the first time in 1952. And this whole I like Ike slogan was a really great one for Eisenhower. People did like him. It's because he was a decent guy who pretty much let his administration run things. We'll talk a little more about him in just a minute. But this is a picture of Eisenhower with his slogan from the 1952 election where he beat Democrat Adlai Stevenson. So this time period from 1945 to the 50s is a great period of time post-war. This should say actually 1941 to 1945, not 1045, but 1941 to 1945. There were 12 million Americans who had served in the military around the world. And when they came home, we see the average marriage age drop. So people are getting married younger. Birth rates soar, families grew. And it's kind of like this celebration about being home from war and this whole idea that because we've been in war, that there's this idea of living now, living for the moment. That's why people are getting married younger. There are also plenty of jobs, so everyone's got an opportunity to work. This whole thing lasted until the mid-60s, and it's called the baby boom. In 1945, there were 37.5 million households, but in 1960, there were almost 53 million households. That's a big jump in that span of time. And it also created this togetherness culture. By 1970, we see close families developing. Their families revolve around the kids. They live in suburban homes, and they believe in entertaining at home. Part of being able to live this good life was the GI Bill, which was passed in 1944 to give benefits to veterans who were honorably discharged from the military through service in World War II. So it gave them money for education, it gave them loans to buy farms or businesses or homes, and it also gave them an unemployment benefit of $20 per week for up to 1 year. So I did the math on this, just compared to that whole increased minimum wage up to 65 cents. And these veterans could get unemployment for $20 a week up to a year. If they had a job at minimum wage, 65 cents an hour, they would have made $26 a week. So this was a pretty fair benefit that they were getting, almost as much as if they were working for federal minimum wage. The GI Bill cost $14.5 billion, but it helped ease the post-war transition and created a more educated public. All of these people created this need to consume. We have a lot of people, they needed a lot of things. Consumerism becomes king. These people had saved during the war because of the Great Depression. So many of these people had lived through the Great Depression. They're brought into World War II, and so they save. These are frugal people. They've got money set aside, and now that the war is over, happy days are here again. They're ready to spend some money for a better life. These people bought cars. They bought some of the first automatic dishwashers and garbage disposals and electric appliances, including the first electric laundry dryers. That changes the whole way of life for people, especially women who had been doing laundry the old-fashioned way, hanging things out to dry for many, many years prior. TV is another thing that comes about in this time period. It became a main seller in this consumerism era, and by 1960, about half of US households had TVs. I think one of my connections with this era is from my dad. He was born in 1941. His family traveled when he was a little bit older. His dad worked in natural gas pipeline installation, so he was part of a company that traveled across the country to install natural gas pipelines. At one point during his career, when my dad was a little boy, they were stationed in New York. And in New York, there were lots of TVs. And so my dad's family had a TV. Well, so my dad's family is originally from Point Cedar. So any of you guys from Hot Spring County, you may know where that is. It's like the outskirts of Bismarck. Anyway, so when they came back to Point Cedar, they brought their TV with them that they bought in New York. And people came, my dad used to tell us, people came from all over the country to look at their TV. And look at their TV is exactly what they did, because there were no stations that were viewable in Point Cedar. So people really literally just came to see the TV itself and to hear about the pictures that they would see on it someday. So I always thought that was funny. People came from far and wide to look at the TV, not to watch it, just to see it. It also increased interest in sports at this time because you could now watch that on TV. And family life at this point starts to center around TV sitcoms and variety shows. And another part of the good life were these Levitt towns that began developing. It's kind of the suburbia situation. Levitt towns were established all over America. These are subdivisions. Now, yes, it creates neighborhoods and creates a sense of community and all of those good things. However, it's important. The bad thing there is that they remained segregated, which creates a living situation that is not good for African Americans or any other race for that matter. The suburbs were full of these new white-collared class members who joined blue-collared class members, and their wives learned to decorate, they gardened, they planned meals, they started DIY projects, and we see a drop in farm workers and a rise in service workers at this time. We also see at this time women starting to supplement their income, at least until their husbands could finish college on the GI Bill. And this is a standard Levittown house with standard Levittown family of 3 children in 1950. Pretty basic house. Looks kind of small, but it's neat, and you can see all of the other houses around it. They're all pretty close, just like our suburbs are today. While we had the good life, we have the other half who's not exactly living the good life. Urban poverty was still a problem. Urban citizens were caught in a web of this poverty and decline. It included war refugees. So while the war veterans were here and reaping the benefits of the GI Bill, we did offer refuge to some war refugees, and they generally centered around these poverty-stricken urban areas where they could afford housing. There wasn't much else there for them. These were unskilled jobs, and most of the people in this urban area were African Americans from the South and Hispanics, along with these war refugees. So it's important to note that these African Americans from the South, you got to remember that this is still during segregation and the Jim Crow South. So urban poverty may have been much better for African Americans than living in the Jim Crow South, which is still very dangerous if you were not white. So like I mentioned, these people were basically unskilled laborers. They took the lowest paying jobs. They moved into housing that had been rejected by the middle class, and they suffered prejudice and discrimination. And ironically, a lot of that's because of where they lived. But they couldn't live anywhere else because they had to take these low paying jobs. So it was a vicious cycle, just like poverty is even still today. It's hard to move up because there were fewer unskilled jobs than in the past. In terms of civil rights, we see little progress in this. As I've already mentioned, Truman, for one, wanted to make a difference, but Congress shot those down. Blacks did have increased political influence during this time period. And so they're really starting to experience some voting power at this time. And the NAACP is also a vital part of that. Another reason that we see some improvement or some leaning toward a civil rights movement in this era is that some Americans were awakened by the World War II and the whole idea of Nazi nationalism. Hitler wanted to create this perfect nation based on race, and he was doing away with other races. It was the whole reason that he fought this war. And some Americans were able to apply that to us. They were able to say, oh my gosh, look at us, we're doing the same thing here. That helped as a springboard for some Americans to realize that our own country was also racially discriminating and that it should be stopped. Still, though, African Americans benefited the least from post-war changes because of that remaining segregation. Like I mentioned, the North was better, so many African Americans left the South and moved to northern cities. Congress was no help in the way of a civil rights movement at this particular point. The Republicans weren't in a situation where they felt like they owed anything to African Americans, and the Dixiecrats were just dead set against any kind of civil rights movement because they wanted to keep the African Americans and other races, other minority races, oppressed. A step in the right direction came in 1954 with the Brown versus the Board of Education Supreme Court decision. This happened in Topeka, Kansas, and the Brown family went to court to say, why does my daughter, who was an African American child, have to get on a bus and be bused all the way across town to a different school when they could literally, she was within walking distance from a school that happened to be white. And the Supreme Court said separate but equal has no place in public schools and that they should integrate, that they must integrate. The problem with that is that there was no direction on how to integrate. It should have been as simple as saying, okay, schools are integrated, but it wasn't, because people weren't exactly sure what to do with this new idea. Remember, you've got people set in their ways, especially Dixiecrats, and for those reasons, segregation did not end immediately just because of the Supreme Court's decision. So that was in 1954. Southern resistance continued, as we all know. If you've had any kind of Arkansas history, you know that in 1957, Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus defied this desegregation order to keep the Little Rock Nine from entering school. Then he even closed Little Rock high schools the following year. In the school year 1958 to 1959, he closed Little Rock high schools so that they just wouldn't have to deal with the issue. And it was his attempt to keep things segregated. So many people there were pretty upset, right? Imagine if you were a senior that year, you would have wanted to finish high school and move on. Many of these people, many of these students, both black and white, went to school in nearby cities. Like Malvern was one of those. Also during this time, Benton did not have an African American high school. So most of the African American students in Benton went to schools in Little Rock for high school. But during this year, 1958 to 1959, which is also called the Lost Year, these students largely came to Malvern to go to Wilson High School. And locally, just wanted to point out that it was actually much later before Malvern schools finally forced this integration. There were some pretty lame school choice options, which kind of gave this idea of token desegregation, which, you know, it's like, hey, you can go to whichever school you want to. But quite honestly, you know, the only people who really used that were white students to go back and forth among the different schools that were available at the time, like Smith Elementary, Fields Elementary, Pratt Elementary. People were switching back and forth. White people were switching back and forth. Very few African American students entered at that time. There were some who entered high school the year before, and some African American elementary students who likewise transferred in. But but there were no white students who transferred into the African American school. I want to make sure I point that out. And so it was actually when the federal government finally came in and said, we're not going to issue federal funding for any school who doesn't do this right away. And at that point, it's a little more detailed than that, but at that point, Malvern schools found a way to make it happen. And they were some of the early ones. Arkadelphia didn't desegregate completely until later. So minorities found ways to make their cases heard. Some of that was through civil disobedience or peaceable protest. Rosa Parks is one person that we remember today for her role in the civil rights movement. She refused to give up her seat to a white man on a bus in Alabama, which was required by the Jim Crow laws. She was arrested and charged $10 for that, but black leaders organized a bus boycott, and they saw this as an opportunity to speak out. Typically, in terms of culture, the polite thing to do would be that a man would give up his bus seat for a woman so she could have a seat. But because Rosa Parks was black, the laws of the South required her to give up her seat to a white man. Martin Luther King was one of the organizers of that bus boycott, and his eloquence and leadership skills made him gain national prominence, and he promoted nonviolent civil disobedience. We see our first Civil Rights Act in the 1950s. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 is the first attempt since Reconstruction to restore voting rights to African American Southerners. The whole idea of this is that they wanted to end the poll tax, which was required. It was a fee that you had to pay in order to vote. Now, it doesn't sound like a big deal, but you know, if you've got to pay $1 or $2 in order to vote, and you're among the community's poorest, you're going to save that $1 or $2 to meet needs. You're not going to pay it to vote. So the Civil Rights Act of 1957 was established to end poll tax and set up the Civil Rights Commission to investigate more voting rights complaints. And it also established the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, which could prosecute these complaints when they were found to be just. The Civil Rights Act of 1960 required voting registrars to keep records for a determined period of time after elections so that they could be examined by federal officials in case a claim came against the election commissions. This leads us into the Cold War era. Anxiety about nuclear holocaust fueled this Cold War. Despite membership in the United Nations, there's some growing distrust between the Soviet Union and the United States. We were two of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations. It was the US, Great Britain, Soviet Union, France, and China. But there's still this distrust over who might do what with their nuclear weapons. And as we already know, we've talked about before, the Axis powers of World War II were Germany, Italy, and Japan. The United Nations also established a Security Council to help settle disputes. And in this unsettled war, Europe remained a disaster after the war, and Russia was also in decline. So since Russia was in decline, they felt especially nervous about what the US might be able to do nuclear-wise. The US and the Soviet Union still possessed power. This conflict became worldwide based on diplomacy, propaganda, economic rivalry, and threat. So we have these two powers, despite the Soviet Union's economic decline after the war, and the US has economic prosperity after the war. So the Soviet Union felt threatened by us. We felt threatened by the Soviet Union because people who are in decline are desperate to thrive. So, when people are desperate, not really sure what they'll do. To be clear, generally when we talk about propaganda, we associate it with the Soviet Union. And it's very important to know that the US also maintained propaganda as well. Propaganda is just kind of spinning news or stories the way you want them to be spun. This emerging conflict between the United States and our allies, in this emerging conflict between the United States and our allies and the Soviet Union, we'd maintained this friendly show during the war, and it ended up being somewhat of a struggle over unclaimed and unaligned territory left after World War II. So the Soviet Union took over neighboring Turkey as part of this unaligned territory. And the US then felt like it must contain the Russians' tendencies to expand. The US comes up with the Marshall Plan, which funnels billions of dollars into Western Europe to help secure their democracies. The Soviets see this as a threat, and this threat leads to the arms race, which is between the US and Russia. In addition to this containment that the US is feeling the need to watch over Russia, they also enter this period of containment in Asia to prevent North Korea from seizing non-communist South Korea. Senator Joseph McCarthy initiates this additional kind of Red Scare, red meaning communism, so this communist scare. And he, along with other Americans, believed that there were internal communists within the American government. And despite the fact that we were allies with Russia in World War II, we still have this fear of communism. And so Joseph McCarthy, the senator from Wisconsin, starts this whole witch hunt of people who are communist. He believed that the State Department was thoroughly infested with communists. I know when I was a kid, I was in 7th, 8th grade, somewhere around there. And one summer, when there was nothing else to watch, long before cable TV existed, PBS aired the McCarthy trials, where he was calling people in to these Senate hearings and accusing them of being communist. a lot of people were blacklisted. Some people were not able to find work anymore because they'd been identified by this man as a communist. And here is a picture of Joseph McCarthy using some visuals to show the supposed power of communism in the United States. And you can see the guy who's got his head on his hand. He's kind of skeptical there. Eventually, the Senate condemns McCarthy, which leads to his downfall. However, this legacy of this fear of communism continued. If you look back through some newspapers, I did some research on segregation a few years ago, and looking back through newspapers to get an idea of community theories about segregation, I didn't see any of those. Specifically researching Malvern and Hot Spring County, there were no editorials or no opinion columns written about segregation or desegregation, but there were always plenty there written about communism. And that's into the 60s even. So we're talking about the 1950s here when McCarthy is pulling these stunts in these Senate hearings. But so even into the 60s and early 70s, the Red Scare, communism, was something that was more discussed than desegregation was at the time. In the next chapter, we'll be talking about JFK's election as president in the 1960 election. So in conclusion, the 1950s were a really prosperous time for America, for a chunk of America, not for everyone. Remember, minorities were still not very prosperous at this time, although there were some improvements made. There was a fear of communism brought by by Senator Joseph McCarthy. The arms race with the Soviet Union began, and times started changing by 1960.